We're beginning chapter 13, Evil in Our Own Backyard. On the morning of September 12, 2001, a small, unexceptionable town tucked into an out-of-the-way corner on the off-beaten-path Gulf Coast of Florida awoke to find itself the center of the world's attention. Reporters arrived in waves at the tiny Venice airport after the identity of the terrorist pilots from the World Trade Center attacks and their relationship with the local flight school became known. NBC's Kerry Sanders' report was typical. 33-year-old Mohomed Atta on the flight manifest of one of the suicide flights, one of those who the FBI suspects took the controls of the hijacked jet. Where did he learn to fly? Venice, Florida. Venice, Florida, where answers to some of the most important questions about what had happened were sketched in, at least in pencil, combining to form what would rapidly become the government's official explanation for the attack. We want to revisit a few of the key moments of that morning, after which shaped our perceptions. But instead of the dumbfounded shock through which we initially watched, okay, I'm just going to read this whole thing over. We want to revisit a few key moments of that morning after, which helped shape our perceptions. But instead of the dumbfounded shock through which we initially watched what happened that day, this time we're fortified with some hard-won knowledge. We've had all the time now to deal with the shock. The plain fact was that, like most people, we had never seen anything so horrific as what we saw on September 11th. Our critical faculties had been swept away by it. There were too many poignant details filling our hearts, which none will ever forget, nor should we. Like the chilling phone call from a flight attendant aboard American Airlines Flight 11, detailing the frantic struggle on the doomed plane as hijackers slit a passenger's throat and stormed the cockpit. Madeline Amy Sweeney's last words to her ground manager in Boston were to tell... What? Manager in Boston were to try to tell them... What? This has to be the author's fuck up, because I can't be that stupid. Madeline Amy Sweeney's last words to her ground manager in Boston were... Oh, okay, this must be her frantic last words. That makes more sense. Were try to tell... Try to tell him where the hijacked plane seemed to be headed. No, that wasn't a quote. I see water and buildings. Oh my God, oh my God. The stark terror faced by hundreds of men and women stranded 1,000 feet in the air above a raging inferno, burning on the floors below them. They had two choices: die in the fire or jump into the void and plummet for 9 seconds before hitting concrete. There was no door 3. The scenes of chaos and terror in New York were coming to us live. Those people leaping out hand in hand, the woman's dress billowing as she fell, a bare-chested man tumbling end over end. Awful things were happening live that human beings should never have to witness, much less endure. We felt it deep. Chaos had been loosed upon the world, upon our world. Bodies littered the plaza, but we didn't see any of that until later on. Arriving at the scene, the chief of police and the mayor saw a pair of feet in their shoes, laying unattached to a body. The head of a middle-aged man went rolling down the street. A woman was sliced in half by a large sheet of glass falling out of the towers. Then came the stories like Jeremy Glick's, who called his wife to tell her to lead a full life, that were almost ineffably sad. The wisest words we heard came from New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, asked in a news conference to estimate how many lives had been lost. It was too early to know, he told reporters. He said, the number of casualties will be more than most of us can bear. He was right. It was in this state of shock and mourning that most of us first heard and let uncritically wash over us explanations for who had committed this unspeakable crime. But now, with the passage of time, we can take a more clear-headed look at some of what was happening in the immediate aftermath of the attack. The FBI first went to Huffman Aviation at 2:30 Wednesday morning. Sue DeSantis, the office manager, let them into the darkened flight school. They returned at 11 a.m., seized files, and carted away at least 8 boxes of records. DeSantis. On television, Rudy Deckers was everywhere being interviewed. What the designated hitter is to baseball, Deckers was to sound bites about the terrorists who had been living among us. Deckers was designated interviewee. At Huffman Aviation, the parking lot quickly filled with satellite news trucks from all the major networks. Reporters from all the major newspapers and news magazines were hanging out in the lobby. Some were watching the story unfold on the TV in the reception area. Others were standing outside smoking and trying to chat up employees. Everyone was there to talk to Rudy Deckers. He was on the Today Show, ABC's Good Morning America, the CBS Early Show, the Dan Rather CBS Evening Show, Larry King Live, CNN Live with Greta Van Susteren, Peter Jennings, and on ABC World News Tonight, he even entered Bill O'Reilly's No Spin Zone. Rudy was doing a lot of fast talking, a talent which local newspapers had already noted he possessed. Waiting for interviews, reporters exchanged ironic sidebar items so bizarre you knew they were true. One of Flight 11 hijackers left a Koran in a strip club in Daytona Beach. The coffee shop at Huffman Aviation gave its entrees aviation-related names. The coffee shop at Huffman Aviation gave its entries aviation-related names. The bacon cheeseburger was known as the emergency descent. What Al Gore and George W. Bush had been fiercely contesting an election all over the state in the bigger news story of the previous year, Mohomed Atta and Marwan al-Shehi had been buzzing up and down the coast of that same state in Cessnas. Who knew? Standing under the glare of TV lights on the apron of the Venice airport the day after the attack, Rudy Deckers told us what he knew, or at least he seemed to in retrospect, as we'll see. It looked as if he may have been making up big chunks of it up as he went along. Over and over, Deckers denied any responsibility for the terrorists being in our midst. They came in through the front door, he told reporters. He said they claimed to be Afghans who had entered this country from Germany. They were normal students and worked very hard. They lived nearby and bicycled here every day, said Deckers. At 46, Rudy Deckers was a round, middle-aged, unprepossessing, and slightly florid man who nonetheless spoke and answered questions with one reporter noted was a clipped Dutch accent and a tone that suggests he used to be barking out orders. If a global network had assisted the development of the terrorist conspiracy which led to the operation, Rudy Deckers would be the first place to look. Both before and after the attack, an unexplained element of intrigue was swirling around him. Yet Deckers seemed free with advice, both to law enforcement and Congress, preventing future attacks. He had saved the day, he said, when those slackers at the FBI were about to leave his flight school without all of the pertinent records. It was yesterday, 2:30 a.m., they called my manager here in Venice and wanted the C2 files, he explained on CBS. I came in at 7 o'clock in the morning. They were still there. I talked briefly with them. They told me they were ready to go. I told them that we had more customers, clients from the Middle East, and I thought it was a good idea to give them all my files. So I gave them a couple hundred files from the last years. Good save, dude. One of his staffers set up a press conference in what looked like a classroom. Some rolled their eyes at the idea that this man was holding a news conference, wrote one reporter who was there. There was talk that Deckers was a media hound. As it turns out, the talk was correct. I asked him why he was doing so many interviews. His office manager, Sue DeSantis, told us months later. Rudy said because it was the best free advertising we would ever get. Mr. Deckers was apparently not one to waste time on remorse when there was a buck to be made. The beefy Deckers was at times a little difficult to understand. He spoke defensively through a thick European accent, but his defensiveness was easier to understand than his accent. Who wouldn't be defensive in such an intense media spotlight over such a numberingly horrific event? Yet, and this is important. Despite all his FaceTime, his testimony was surprisingly devoid of revelations or insights. We didn't learn much, except that he didn't like Atta. If you see the picture in the newspaper, you see the face. Tell me what you think, he said. I just didn't like the face. I have no explanation. He did, however, sort of like the chubby one. The other guy, said Deckers, referring to Al-Shehi, was the teddy bear. He was friendly. I have found out in my life that chubby guys are always a little bit more friendly. The day after witnessing 3,000 vaporized bodies, Rudy Deckers, holding forth on Larry King on his theory about the jolly nature of chubby guys, seemed more than just a little beside the point. But they let him get away with it. Deckers insisted to all who would listen that, where the terrorists were concerned, he was filled with an unspeakably murderous rage. This morning at 7 o'clock, I heard what happened. And the first thing I questioned myself was, if I would have known, I would kill them with my own bare hands. If I have a Muslim coming in right now, I think I'm going to be a human being and tell them to get the hell out of my property here. In another interview, he said, "We feel awful that we had seen These awful men, no, these monsters, in this school. If I saw them now, I would want to murder them, kill them, like every other American at this moment. His reassurances may have had a purpose. Tensions were running high. About 3 p.m., officers from the Sarasota County Sheriff's Office and the Venice Police Department arrived at Huffman Aviation, saying they were looking for a suspicious blue Toyota that reportedly was on the premises. I hope they're not going to plant a bomb here. If they're really here, said an employee behind the desk who did not want to give his name. Several minutes later, the law enforcement official left the building, saying there was no danger. The vehicle had belonged to a Brazilian news crew. A couple of people called and said, "How could you do this?" explained Greg Wood, a flight instructor at Huffman. Emotions are very high. Earlier that day, the Venice Gondolier ran a huge black headline across the top of the paper, "Evil in Our Own Backyard." Underneath was a picture of Rudy Deckers facing a phalanx of TV cameras, speaking into a forest of microphones. The irony of the juxtaposition did not go unnoticed. At first, everyone just thought it was kind of funny, said a family member of Huffman employees, because he made Deckers look like he was the evil in our own backyard, which the newspaper probably didn't mean. And then it hit me that he'd started his flight school not long before those two terrorists moved into town, and it gave me the chills. Less than 24 hours after the September 11th attack, Rudy Deckers, whose school will eventually be shown to have trained a veritable squadron of terrorist pilots, seemed impervious to suspicion. What suspicion? He was schmoozing with the king himself on Larry King Live. Were they of a nationality other than American? King asked. No, they weren't. My people took copies of their passports when they came in, because they needed to show ID, and apparently they were. One of them was in Afghanistan. I don't know what the other one was, replied Deckers. I don't see the files myself because I have my managers taking care of that. I have spoken with one of them in several occasions, and Mr. Atta, I spoke with him 1 to 5 minutes. Larry King showed why he is famous for never preparing for an interview, asking Deckers, "That's Mohomed Atta, right?" Mohomed Atta, that's correct. Hard-hitting American journalism is the envy of the free world. Larry King's sign-off with Deckers was love and kisses. Rudy, thank you, King murmurs. I know how tough this must be for you. Tough for the rest of us, maybe. Not tough for Deckers, CBS's Jane Clayson on CBS Morning News asked him. And I know it is difficult because you in some sense feel a little bit of the responsibility, don't you? No, we don't feel responsible for what happened at all, Deckers replied. No, not nothing. He was just running a business. There was a mercantilist approach to much of what he said. I don't need anything from you, just a check to start flying. He liked flying lessons to shopping for groceries. We're just a business. The stream of Middle Eastern men who walked up to his counter thrust out cash money, tens of thousands of dollars at a time. What did we expect him to do? Not take it? It has not registered on him as a source for concern. All he did was take their money and teach them to fly. But he didn't teach them to fly into anything. Most took his point, but for Deckers' school, a tiny airport located on a former military installation, the connection to terrorists Mohomed Atta and Marwan al-Shehi prompted troublesome questions about his operations. Deckers said his school was typical of what existed in Florida and the rest of the United States. For years, he said, flight schools have been advertising on the lucrative foreign market. More than 2/3 of Huffman's students were from overseas. He owned another flight school further south in Naples, Florida, that also catered to foreigners. In a wire service report 3 days after the World Trade Center disaster, Deckers was quoted saying, "I can tell you that there's definitely some flaws in the system." Later, we would realize it had been one of his few truthful statements. The day that all this occurred, we felt very, very sad, like all the other Americans, he said on the CBS Morning News. Expressions of sympathy are clearly in order, but Deckers isn't American. He's Dutch. His flight school offered instruction in light single-engine aircraft, he said, but not in commercial jetliners. He insisted the terrorist pilots couldn't have learned to hit skyscrapers with 757s merely from enrolling in his school. He had followed the law. He repeatedly stated the terrorist pilots Atta and Marwan were people who basically walked in off the street into his school at the Venice airport. Dan Rather, the only newsman in Dealey Plaza during the Kennedy administration, didn't see anything then, and not much has changed. Rather asking Deckers, is this unusual for someone to come from Afghanistan or, for that matter, any place overseas, show up at the door and say, okay, I'll pay you the $10,000, train me to fly. Is that unusual? If we call that 2 or 3% of the business is that way, and it's unusual, yes, Deckers replied, but there are numerous students who are not happy with the flight school where they are, and they just are already in the United States, and they go to another flight school where they're happy. They told us they were flying in another area where they were not happy, and they wanted to change flight schools. There had been another flight school. I need something to drink. Federal investigators returned to Venice Municipal Airport late the day after the attack and combed through the records at Florida Flight Training Center, owned by Arnie Kruithof. Like Deckers, Kruithof was a Dutch national. His doors were closed, while federal investigators, who declined to say what they were looking for, worked inside. A sign on the door read, "Due to a national emergency, we will be closed until further notice." Kruithof said he couldn't talk about the federal investigation that had shined a spotlight on the small airport and the 2 Dutch-owned flight schools. All our records were sacrificed yesterday, Wednesday, as a part of that investigation. I can't release any information about what was taken. In all, 27 terrorists were trained to fly, the LA Times reported. Among the 400 foreign nationals who rotated through Deckers' 2 flight schools, the second down the road in Naples, and an as yet undisclosed number had been terrorists. While the number remained undisclosed in the months ahead, it was nonetheless slowly growing. There was no speculation in the media, however, about why young men with a pronounced weakness for lingerie models and strippers had chosen a sleepy enclave filled with windows with blue hair, so far from the pleasures of infidel flesh. Take this pop quiz, multiple choice. You've only got a year to live. Would you move to Leisure World or head to Vegas? While Deckers insisted the terrorist pilots had only the most fleeting of associations with his flight school and hotly denied being anything other than a victimized businessman, questions remained. There were over 200 flight schools just in Florida alone, yet somehow the hijackers leaned toward one or the other. Of the two schools in Venice. The twin Venice flight schools were the terrorists' American beachhead. Rudy Deckers' Huffman Aviation was the terrorists' Omaha Beach. What had made these two schools so popular with the terrorist cadre? No one asked. The only investigation being conducted pointed a finger directly at an obscure, unfit, most had never even heard of, called Al-Qaeda, the base. I mean, my flow's getting all fucked up. The only investigation being conducted pointed a finger directly at an obscure outfit most had never even heard of, called Al-Qaeda, the base, while the FBI was presumably actively looking for any international networks that might have assisted the terrorists. Were any likely suspected overlooked, maybe even protected from scrutiny? Maybe the FBI should have taken a peek closer to home, because it did not seem like the FBI was looking too deeply or too hard. We interviewed numerous material eyewitnesses with important information who were never contacted by the FBI, which supposedly fielded 400 agents in Florida until the anthrax attack changed their focus. And they never went back. The FBI came down almost immediately after September 11th, said Huffman office manager Sue DeSantis. The employee who let the FBI into the school at 2:30 in the morning, she later told us, it just totally amazed me that they took everything, Rudy said as the truth. Could the FBI be somehow institutionally incurious? Or maybe they didn't need to investigate Rudy Deckers because they already knew who he was. Danielle Clark was the office manager at Ambassador Aviation in Naples. The first thing I noticed on September 11th when I walked into Ambassador was that they had all these TVs on, one big one in reception and another in the student room. And they had never been on before, she told us. Clark said she noticed something strange about the way the FBI agent who was there talked to Rudy. I could hear them in the other office. The FBI agent was coaching Rudy on what to tell the reporters outside. For some reason, a lack of enthusiasm permeated the FBI's investigation of Rudy Deckers, the man who ran the FBO, fixed-based operation, at the tiny airport as well as the flight school. Water. Getting talking cramps today. Weird. "40 years after, 40 years after. 40 years ago, the Bureau displayed a similar lack of enthusiasm in investigating another man who ran an FBO, what was it, fixed base operation, CIA agent David Ferry, in New Orleans. A researcher called to say that Deckers sounded phony to her when she'd seen him on TV. The single biggest weak link in the current case is Rudy Deckers of Huffman Aviation in Venice, Florida, just minutes away from where the president was when the attack occurred, she wrote. He's the guy that trained the pilots. Look at his corporate records. They're on file, on the net even. Look at his links to companies that claim they're leasing 757s and 767s from an airline that doesn't own any. Look at how many businesses he's involved with. Look at who flies in and out of the airport where he operates. Find out why he hasn't filed his required annual reports with the Florida Secretary of State's office listing his officers. We found it bizarre that no one in the media questioned Deckers publicly about what role he may have played or what he may have done to facilitate what happened on September 11th. If the FBI was buying his explanation, however, it wasn't on account of his sterling reputation. 2 weeks before the World Trade Center attack, Nicole Antini, an employee of Deckers, filed suit to enforce settlement of a sexual harassment suit against him. I tolerated Rudy's advances because I needed to keep my job, said the former Deckers' employee in court documents. As long as I have worked at Huffman Aviation, I have been subjected to sexual harassment by Rudy Deckers, she stated. Court documents reveal that this wasn't just garden variety sexual harassment. No inadvertent touch or misunderstood word. The employee was 18. Her employer, Rudy Deckers, had apparently gotten a thrill from sticking broom handles up the back of her dress when she wasn't looking. Several months later, he would be invited to testify before the Congress of the United States of America on preventing future terrorist attacks. We find this odd. Amanda Keller knew Rudy Deckers. I saw Rudy Deckers. He's a total pervert, a nasty man, she told us. He said to me one time, "What would it take for me to have a piece of you?" I looked at him and said, "You're lucky I don't hit you," and his secretary applauded me. He told her to sit down and shut up. So Deckers wasn't being shielded from scrutiny, from serious scrutiny, because he sang loud in church. What then? Why was Rudy Deckers protected, and by whom? Flight school owners don't have the juice like that. Where did he get his stroke? Rudy Deckers was covered, we discovered, by the same umbrella his flight school student Mohomed Atta huddled under. Rudy was a grateful beneficiary of Saudi cover. While Deckers had been minimizing his involvement with the terrorists in front of reporters in Venice the day after the attack, across the state, in Vero Beach, CNN reported, FBI agents were searching houses occupied by Saudi pilots they found suspicious, who said they were on a 15-month pilot's course at Huffman Aviation. News accounts reported the same thing, one said. Some of the kamikaze pilots had pilot's licenses that indicated they were sponsored or employed by Saudi Arabian Airlines, which is owned by the Saudi government. Not a single reporter pressed Deckers on his Saudi connections. He got a pass. The story of his cozy Saudi relations doesn't end there. It goes right to the bin Laden family itself. By 3 weeks after the attack, people were standing clear of Rudy Deckers on the tarmac at the Venice airport. Former associates pled ignorance. Key employees denied comment, saying they were no longer with the company. Late at night in Venice, when it got really quiet, you could almost hear the mournful sound of people whistling past the graveyard. Some seemed already to be constructing a defense. Venice airport manager Larry Heath told reporters the city's relations with Huffman that hadn't been the same since Deckers took over. If he weren't one of the city's officials responsible for approving his presence at the airport, airport manager Heath allowed that the revelations about Venice's connections to the terrorist attacks were absolutely amazing. He said, "I hope it doesn't give us a black eye." That's it for today's chapter. Chapter 14 tomorrow, the Venice Magic Dutch Boys.